Good morning. It's good to see you all here. Wow, this is what happens when people show up. I'm not used to that. I'm not used to that at all. So it's great to see you all here. Right before I came up here, my wife told me, Joel, no jokes. I guess she doesn't like my sense of humor or something, but so I'll leave Dan to tell all the jokes. So I'm not. So anyway, I guess she knows my sense of humor is a little lacking, but I thought I was funny most of the time. So, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Stark Lecture for the fall semester of 2023. Today, it's a privilege to be able to introduce our distinguished Dr. Dan Kittle. So thank you that's great. I knew when we selected the topic for this year's DWU lecture series that Dan would be an important person to get as a part of that conversation. And I also really wanted to provide a context for Dan to be able to speak to the student body and those collected here on a personal level about things that are very important to him, to speak into our lives, so to speak. So the Stark Lectureship was established in 1959 by Franklin Stark, a dedicated alumnus of our institution. And it has consistently sought to fulfill its mission to present publicly persons who are living examples of the truth of the gospel and who demonstrate by the authenticity of their lives the connection today that exists between faith and works. And so if you want to think of what the Stark Lectureship is all about, it's a lectureship that explores the place where faith and works intersect each other. And so we're profoundly impacted by faith and works as they intersect in society. Our previous Stark Lectures have been famous persons like Elton Trueblood, a famous theologian, humanitarian Naomi Tutu, daughter of the famous Bishop Desmond Tutu, Senator Mark Hatfield, renowned columnist Cal Thomas, a very acclaimed Christian writer, Donald Miller, and, of course, I have to mention the Senator and humanitarian George McGovern. I believe he's spoken twice as Stark Lecture, which is an award of some sort. Not quite like the Nobel Peace Prize, but quite. So, as we gather today at the cusp of this fall lectureship, and the beginning of our Stark Lectureship, we gather with anticipation to hear from Dr. Dan Kittle, the president of Dakota Wesleyan. And his presentation is A Life Worth Living, a Rural Perspective. So please join me in extending a warm invitation and appreciation to Dr. Dan Kittle. So Dan, come and speak with us.
Thanks, Joel. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Allen. Appreciate the introduction. And just a few thank yous to kind of begin as well. I want to make a shout out to Lexi as well. This summer, she and I had a number of conversations about vocation and discernment, and some of those I think have entered into Uni 101, thanks to Dr. Weber and the other Uni 101 professors. And thanks for all of you for being here. I know some of you were required, I guess, to be here? But that's okay. That's okay. What I hope to accomplish today is some engagement in this topic. And I was just joking with a colleague of mine that, you know, this is a big topic in terms of what it means to live a life worth living. And so what I hope to do today is to really provide some context for this conversation, lean into a couple of stories. I'll share a few stories about myself, hoping that in sharing those stories, it might spark some stories of your own. So all I ask of you today is to try, for the next 30 to 40 minutes to be present and to think of things as I do, as I present them to you. Maybe think of some things that might trigger for you, that might give you some insight into your own way of how you've made meaning about what it means to live a life worth living. So we're going to get to this last piece, that last piece on this slide in terms of vocation and how that's a framework for me that's meaningful and important to me, but I think we have to build up to that. So this is a bit of what we hope to accomplish. And where I wanted to begin is in terms of myself a little bit, because I think when we have speakers come and we have people who have a privilege of having a title like a president or being a doctor or being a director or a coach and so on. We have these ways of thinking about these people that really is not all that authentic, right? So, when we even read a bio or hear what someone's accomplished, that's an end. But how they got there and who they are is much more complex. And so I'll just give you a little bit of that to also frame our conversation. So the first is I grew up in a small town called Bezetta, Ohio, which I guarantee no one has ever heard of. It's a township of about 700 people in northeast Ohio, so this part of Ohio, about an hour south of Cleveland. And while I was there, I had the opportunity and the good fortune to be raised by just wonderful parents and another family that became a family to me as well. And so this was, idyllic in many ways. You can chuckle, it's okay, this is me. I told you there, yeah. I'm not telling jokes, but I have pictures. So part of this formative experience for me was being engaged in two activities that were very meaningful to me as a high school student, and even before that. And one of them is in being in the band, and the other of them was being a basketball player. I was involved in other sports, but this was really a sport that was very important to me in my development. And again, just keep this in mind in terms of how it influences who I am, right? This idea of being in an academic community was so foreign to me as a kid. I mean, I never aspired to be a teacher, a faculty member, certainly never aspired to be a university president. But what's come of that, this experience in particular about band and basketball, is that part of what I claim as a gift now in terms of my own vocation is being a bridge builder. And it started because of these early experiences in band and in basketball, being a student athlete and being in music, and sort of seeing where those pieces came together. The other piece that was informative, and we all have these pieces of our stories, was some loss and some tragedy in my life. So that's me there, again in the middle. That's a Bugle Boy sweater, which was really popular in the 80s. I still remember being proud of, this was at Christmas time, and I can still remember being proud of getting that sweater. I know, it's the little things. So on each side of me are my older brothers. And so my brother Joe, and then my oldest brother Nick. And the story, and I'll say more about this later, but my oldest brother passed away shortly after this. He passed away when he was 26, and I was just turning 17. I was 16 at the time, so this was our last Christmas together. And it was in a boating accident. It was one of those what I'll call later pivot points in my own life. And we've all had those pivot points, right? Those moments where our lives are altered in ways that's unanticipated and that we have to make sense of. And I share this for two reasons. One is that it influences how I see the world. And the second thing is that everybody experiences this differently. My other brother in this picture, he never, to be honest, he never recovered from that loss. It derailed his life in ways that were sad. So again, just giving you some context from my own life. The last thing is, I'll say just not much about, but in terms of how I then, because of these other things, understand opportunity and find motivation, okay, that they're influenced by these as well. Share these stories, hoping to, spark and inspire some of your own stories. So these first three questions, if I were to ask you, who are the people that influenced your life? What are the moments, these pivot points in your life? And the third, which is sometimes a little harder, but what are the organizations and institutions that influenced you? I bet you could, to yourself, you could name these people, right? You could name these moments. You could maybe even name the organizations. The organizations is kind of the harder one. What's an example of an organization that you think has impacted your life? Just so we can make sure. What's an example of an organization? Club, organization that's impacted your life? Scouting. What was that? United Way. Church. Sometimes one people forget is the organization or the company their parents worked for. That has an influence and impact in your life. So these things, they impact your life. what I'd say at the bottom here is it's easy to list the names, the moments, the organizations, but it's harder for us as part of our own human condition to really unpack how they influence you. So I'm going to give you 2 ways that helps me kind of make sense of this. One is I'm trying to think, so I see a couple people that have like glasses on, right, or have a hat on, or how many of you have contacts in, right? So how many of you, I'm sure none of you that just raised your hand who have contacts in were conscious of wearing contacts, right? Like my colleague Kitty is wearing glasses. I'm sure she's not conscious of wearing glasses. Same thing with wearing a hat, right? You forget about it. You don't think about it after a while. I think of that in terms of our lens through which we see the world, right? Those things that I mentioned earlier in my own personal journey, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, that influences how I make sense of the world, okay? So a personal example of this is that prior to being a president, I was a dean of students. And that job gave me the opportunity to work with some of the students that were some of the best and some of the brightest, and then work with some of the students who were struggling the most and who disappointed themselves, their institution, and their peers. And when I first had those conversations of like interventions with them, I could almost feel my own sense of like anger is probably too strong of a word, but like a deep disappointment. And I had to really pause and say, why is this upsetting for me personally? And it became because, again, like in my life, first generation college student, I saw college, being at a university, as a real privilege. And it really kind of irritated me that students were squandering that opportunity, okay? But that was my own lens. That was my own lens, my own way of thinking about it. So, again, we're not conscious of these things unless we offer some introspection and reflection and we get to them through conversation. Another way of thinking about them would be this idea of rules of the game, okay? So think about these in terms of, the rules of the game provide the box that we are living in. We can color outside of the box, but we all start with some common rules of the game. So 2 examples here that I think will resonate with you in hopefully one fashion or the other. The first would be music. So what are some basic principles from my music folks in the audience here? What are some basic principles, frameworks within music? Time signature. What else? Key. The notes, the beats, the rhythms, the melodies, right? So these are the rules of the game. So if you look at, the evolution of music, right? We start with, not start with, but I remember from my music theory and my music history classes, right? The influence of Gregorian chants, to opera, to orchestral music, to big bang, or to the big band music, to synthesized music, right? Coming in the late 70s and the 80s, to Taylor Swift, to Imagine Dragons, right? Where there's this evolution of artists who took these basic principles and frameworks and they've innovated. Okay, so the point is here that you take those rules, you're in that box, but you innovate over time. Same thing true in terms of I mentioned earlier I love basketball, right? So the game of basketball has evolved, right? It has changed over time. So again, somebody who knows basketball here, tell me just real briefly how the game of basketball has evolved and changed. 3-point line. So shooting is a much more prevalent, right? What else? Shot clock, in terms of the pace of the game, has changed. What about the roles of players, right? How had it been and how is it now in terms of players? Yep. So when I think about this, I think in terms of the evolution of like what it meant to be a point guard, right? Like you had John Stockton, very traditional point guard, to you have now a 6'9", 270, 80 pound, versatile player being point guard. Same thing in terms of how we define what it meant to be a center. You have Patrick Ewing, and now you've got a guy who's coming in who's I think he's like 7'5", Victor Wembanyama. Very different, right? So you moved from very position-specific to positionless basketball. Again, rules, but there's an evolution of the game as well. So just briefly, the same thing is true in terms of science, right? So I'm using the word of frameworks or systems or rules of the game. In science, we talk about paradigms, and you've all probably talked about this, going from a geocentric to heliocentric in terms of what that looks like in the science principles. Physics has gone from the Newtonian, right, to theory of relativity and quantum physics. So these principles, these frameworks, are applicable in lots of different contexts for us. So here's the argument, okay? The argument is that we have these frameworks, we have these rules, we have these ways of looking at the world. We don't often recognize their impact. We don't give them much consideration, okay? And what I'm arguing for this morning is that we have to acknowledge them, we have to consider them in order to have this bigger conversation about what it means to live a life worth living. So, the question for you is, what are frameworks or paradigms that you think you bring to DWU? Anybody willing to give an example of something that, as we've talked so far, that came to mind for you? This is kind of my opportunity to check in with the audience. Yep, so DWU is a home away from home. So that's probably something that you were looking for, that was important to you. Family dynamics, right? Well said. We've all got family dynamics that have impacted our lives and how we enter this university community. That's another example. Level of engagement. Yeah, so in terms of like our own personal lives, yeah. So one of the frameworks that was lifted up in terms of our conversation is, what does it mean to live in a rural community, right? So I list a number of potentially negative ways of looking at and potentially positive. I'm not going to go through all of these, but certainly the negatives, we think about the limits of living in a rural community, right? The limits in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of limits of what there is to do. There's some narrative of decline. I put consolidation on there. I mean, how many of you were in a situation where your school was consolidated, a school consolidation? You may not even know, but so several of you. That's an element. Positive, if we were to talk about this, being resilient, being neighborly, it's safe, it's comfortable. There's a great deal of pride in terms of living in these rural communities. So not all of us, but for many of us in this room, this is one of those frameworks, right? One lens through which you see the world. So again, I'm going to just share a little bit about my own story here. On the far left is a picture. It's one of my favorite pictures that I have in our family history. That's of my grandmother. And she is in this extraordinarily small town called Majestic, Kentucky, which I tried to look up and see what the population was at this time in the early 1900s, but I couldn't find it, but now it's a population of about 700 people. So this tiny town, and she and her family made the way to where I grew up in that northeast Ohio part of the kind of in the parts of Pennsylvania there, because of the steel mills, right? So that next picture there are two people working in a steel mill, which, Pittsburgh, Youngstown, those were very much steel mill towns. And that's what brought my family to that area. The other thing that brought my family to the area was my other grandmother was a Rosie the Riveter, right? So she was, during World War II, while my grandfather was off in the war, she moved to Akron to work on B-52 bombers in the Goodyear plant in Akron, Ohio. So that's another pool. And then both of my parents worked for General Motors. So this is an assembly line picture. So that's what brought them there. And again, this is sort of the influence of my own life, that we develop our identities in these communities based on what that means to us. I alluded to earlier one of my own pivot points, right, in terms of Yeah, some of you chuckle about yeah. See, do you know the Friends episode, Pivot? Yeah, a few of you got that one. So I alluded earlier to my own sort of personal pivot point, but what I'd also argue is that communities have these pivot points as well, right? These forks in the road. So that picture there in the top right is the picture of the same steel mill 80 years later, right? So the steel mill that brought my family to this area of Northeast Ohio has now closed, and it's rusting and decaying in front of you. The second thing that's happened just in the last decade is that the place where my parents work, General Motors in Lordstown, Ohio, was at one point employing almost 10,000 people, has now closed. And it's had this ripple effect in terms of both the rural community I grew up in, but that whole region, that whole area. So these communities are in places of pivot points. And I raise this because we think about it in terms of our own life and what it takes to find our way through those pivot points. But it also takes leadership, service, faith, and learning, those values of our institution, to help communities through these pivot points as well. So again, these are just examples, and I invite you, to be thinking about, okay, well, what are some of the pivot points in my own life? What are these moments where I've experienced some kind of loss, some kind of unexpected hardship or challenge, and how has that changed me? In good ways, and if we're honest with ourselves, how has it maybe changed us in some ways that maybe aren't so healthy? And how do we come to terms with that and with those impacts in our lives? So again, just a question for you. If you think about these pivot points in terms of individuals and communities, what are some common themes that you hear people thinking about or talking about in the midst of these pivot points? What are some ways of describing these or talking about them at pivot points, do you think? What's that? Yeah, you can feel alone, absolutely. What else? Very isolating feeling. Depressed. It's a hardship. So part of these is, again, you can fracture communities, you can feel alone. There's this hardship piece. It's also an opportunity for resilience, for managing change. There can be moments of celebration in these transitions as well, as far as this is who we are, and that's who we used to be. You can see that in communities as well as with individuals. So again, let's just make sure you're with me. What's been my central argument so far? Growth. Yep, what else? I'm sorry? Yep, working together. I hear some whispers. What else? What do we have to do before we talk about the big question? What do we have to do before we think about the bigger questions of meaning and purpose in life? Yes, thank you. Yep, so self-reflection, okay? And then I offer these frameworks, these rules of the game to help us begin thinking about them. So for me, one of the assignments that so many of you, not all of you I know, but many of you are first-year students, and so I'll speak to you just briefly. One of the most joyful things I had an opportunity in my career to do was to teach a first-year seminar class. And I would give them what we called a family history assignment. And they would think this was going to be, it was always interesting because oftentimes what would happen is they'd find something they didn't know in terms of their family history, right? But then the other question I asked them to think about was, well, what impact does that have on who you are today? So a good example of that is maybe relevant for some of you is you might say, okay, my family, they worked in agriculture, they worked in farming, but I don't plan to do that. Well, the question then becomes, even though you don't plan to go into agriculture or farming, what impact does that have on how you see the world? Another thing might be true in terms of, I was my family owned a family business, but I don't plan to go into that family business maybe. Okay, well, there's still some impact in terms of how that has influenced your way of making sense of the world. So again, just inviting you to be trying to think about some of these pieces that might impact how you see what it means to live a life worth living. So I'm going to go through these quickly, right? But so I've been speaking more locally, individually about making meaning. Certainly our pop culture, particularly as an American society, has lots of ways of framing what it means to be successful, what it means to live a life worth living. So I'm going to work through these, and some of these you'll recognize, some of these you won't, just based on your own kind of personal interest. The first is this idea of a singular hero, and that I put this drum major instinct. If you've never read or heard Dr. King's drum major instinct speech, it's worth a listen. And what he's talking about there is that there's a desire to be first, a desire to be out front, a desire to be seen, and he describes this as a drum major, right? That's our instinct. And the part of what his speech is about is reframing that to be a champion for justice, right? If we're going to be out there, if we're going to be out front, let's make sure we're working towards things that are noble and just. So that's one, and then the other pieces are just connections to characters, maybe in Stranger Things or Gilmore Girls or the Marvel movies. There's lots of examples of how the singular hero is a way in which we think about what it means to be worthy. The other is chasing your dreams, right? So Little Mermaid, that's the central piece of that. My favorite movie, if you haven't, this is an older movie, but my favorite movie is called Rudy. It's about this football player who just is chasing his dream to play for Notre Dame, and it's remarkable lessons along the way. And then J.K. Rowling, right? I mean, until 31, she was a single mom on welfare, right? So she's an illustration of chasing her dream to being an author. I was trying to think about other examples of this, but sort of material and financial prosperity, the Kardashians, right, are an example of this. There's probably others if I had asked some more students to think about what were examples. Again, the message here is that we, as Americans, receive these kinds of messages over and over again about what it means to be successful, what it means to be living a life worth living. And then the last one here is this idea of individuality, embracing your uniqueness. Certainly Mulan is a wonderful example of that, of breaking societal expectation, showing courage and strength. Elsa, right, from Frozen, embracing her unique gifts. Paw Patrol is on there. That was really influential to my son, that each one of them have a role, right? They're embracing their uniqueness in terms of what it means to be a hero. And then, Taylor Swift in terms of not just her individually, but how she's presented her art through this Eras tour is very much about embracing her own story and uniqueness. So those are pop culture. I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about the role of literature in this. So, take this as an invitation, really not an invitation, but an argument for the influence and the power of literature. And these are just four 2 books and a couple of authors that have influenced how I see the world. So The Alchemist is my favorite book. There's lots to unpack there. Langston Hughes is a wonderful poet, playwright, novelist. He wrote a poem that I've gone back to called Theme for English B. Again, this is The Artist's Way. It's about creativity, putting creativity at the center of your life. And then the author, Doris Kearns Goodwin, has written a number of exceptional pieces. And it helps me make sense of what it means to be a leader. She really, I think, frames that well. So this is the piece in terms of my argument for literature being another way that we can access and maybe reimagine our lives. That's part of the power of literature. So I put this in there in terms of for students in particular, right? Here's the thesis statement, right? Here's what I'm arguing, okay? Our emotions, our feelings, our behaviors, they're influenced not just by the events in our lives, but even more importantly, how we perceive those events and experiences. So how we perceive them matters. You've all heard this or seen this in one form or fashion or another, but that's the central argument. So now for the piece I've been kind of working towards in terms of vocation and discernment, okay? So you've maybe heard me say or heard others say this idea of vocation, and I think that the simplest way to illustrate this is if you think about it in terms of your two hands. So on the one hand would be your gifts, your talents, your passions. On the other hand would be the needs of the world, right? And where those meet is how I understand vocation, right? So gifts, talents, passions, needs of the world, where those meet is what I think of in terms of your vocation. So I'm going to come back to a little bit more about what it means, but what it's not one role, it's not simply a job, and it's likely not the same vocation throughout a lifetime, although I think there are some themes in our lives. There's not one moment of epiphany where if you just sit quietly long enough or I think about it hard enough, you're going to discover and claim this calling. That's not been my own experience. They're built, right? That these are built through experiences, that they're not simply discovered. So does that make sense in terms of gifts, talents, needs of the world, where those meet? So I see there's a few of my colleagues in the room. So to my colleagues, how have you discovered and claimed these callings? What's it been like for you in your own life? Just as a brief piece to find a vocation. What's that process been like? Someone willing to share? Yes, thank you. Yep, trial and error. Well said. Thanks, Coach. Anybody else?
Curiosity about other ways.
Yes, so curiosity, about other ways. Absolutely. Maybe one more? It's not a straight path. Amen, right? So being curious, being open, trial and error, not a straight path. And the other piece that I would lift up would be some kind of reflection, right? Like you have these relationships, you have these moments where you have to be reflective in terms of, what it is that I'm called to do. The other thing that I would invite you, particularly as students, 'cause sometimes it can be a little bit, too theoretical when we think about these ideas of gifts. And what I would invite you to think about is what are some things that like your friends or your family or those that have been around you, what have they been telling you about yourself that you're good at or that's a part of who you are for years and years and years? That is a seed of what you can claim as a gift or talent or something. The other one is that the idea, going back to Dr. Allen's curiosity. What's something that you gravitate towards, even though there's no requirement to do that, right? You might be there's a podcast you're listening to or that you're interested in a YouTube or something like that. That those are also seeds for that first, gifts, talents, and passions. In order to understand the needs of the world, I believe you have to be at a place like this. Okay, so this is the other argument I'd make for one of the reasons why university education is so important. If you really want to know what it is how you can play a role in the world, you have to come to understand the challenges and opportunities that we face, right? And that requires some interdisciplinary thinking. It requires the ability to be able to write well, to speak well, to understand science and math and social sciences and religion and so on and so forth, right? These opportunities we have before us and the challenges are interconnected. So it requires, I think, a university education to understand the other piece when we look at those two coming together. What are the needs of the world? So I would be remiss if I didn't share this quote. So Frederick Buechner is probably the most well-known writer and theologian around this idea of vocation. There's lots, this field of research and thought has really exploded just in the last probably 10 or 15 years. But Frederick Buechner was the one that said the place God calls you is to the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So another way of describing illustrating those two hands that I talked about. So I'm going to have one more slide here, and then I'm going to invite some questions and comments. So one of my favorite quotes that comes from, and it's a little bit of a longer one, comes from President Roosevelt, and I'll read this quickly. It says, "The credit belongs to one actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who knows the great enthusiasms and the great devotions, who spends themselves in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if they fail, at least fails while daring greatly." Right? Coach Lynch talked about it being sort of trial and error. That's what the invitation is for you. If you're at all serious about what it means to live a life worth living, it's not one simply about introspection and reflection. It's also about doing, right? It's about experimenting. It's about putting yourself out there. And that's a message for all of us, right? And whether we're new to this community or whether we're getting ready to exit this community and head elsewhere, we have to be able to act and reflect in our lives. Those two pieces, I think, are very critical. So I'm going to stop there and see if maybe there might be a couple comments or questions, reactions, thoughts, pieces you think I missed. Yeah, maybe Dr. Allen, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Dan. Are there
Yeah.
questions anybody wants to ask a question of Dr. Kittle this morning, dealing with your understanding of your vocation and your place in the world, your calling? Yes, where do I hear it? Oh, way up there, Tim, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
When I think of turning points, whether it be a natural disaster or divorce or losing a job, losing a career, I think the old adage, you can't always control what other people do, but you can control how you react to the situation. I mean, you can react negatively to some life events,
Yeah.
or you can do it in a more positive way.
Yes, if you didn't hear that, I think you probably did, but you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. I certainly understand the adage of that, and I'll just share briefly how I've come to, through loss and tragedy in two very different ways. So I shared briefly the loss of my brother, and that was one that I held on to in my life, like that still informs, really almost daily. I think about him or something reminds me of him or of that loss. I've held on to it in ways that I hope now have become healthy expressions. Maybe about 10 years ago, I lost my nephew to suicide. And, that was extraordinarily difficult, for my wife and for me and our whole family. And that experience, right, one I couldn't control, has given me a different empathy for people who struggle with mental health, but it's also been one I've had to let go of. So I share that only because I think that there's not some prescriptive way of finding our way through these hardships, both personally or in terms of the community. For some of them, I think you have to hold on to and make sense of and make them a part of your life. And for me, others I've had to come to terms with and then let go in order to be able to function in terms of those hardships. Yeah, in the back there, Dr. Allen.
Oh, there we are. Hey, Olivia.
So a lot of us have what we describe as turning points. We have a lot of them.
Yeah.
And a lot of them tend to point you in different directions. So how do you pick one direction or a main direction to follow?
That's a good point. I mean, I think with time and reflection, you'll start to trust yourself in ways. I guess what I hope you might take away is that we have to spend time in those places to make sense of them, I think, is the first message. And the second one I probably underemphasize emphasized is that we have to do that in communities. And that might be a community of just one other person. It might be small group communities. But they help, at least they've helped me make sense of those pushes and pulls and feelings like you're in different directions. And the other thing that I would say is that you have to try, you have to experiment. You have to put yourself out there and say, you know, I think I might be interested in this, so I'm gonna try it, right? I mean, one of the great gifts I think of Dakota Wesleyan, I take for example like education majors. Like I know within your first year, I think maybe in your first semester, like you're in a school, okay? So I mean, if you think, hey, I might want to be a teacher, that's a great opportunity. And I hope that if you find yourself in that context and it doesn't resonate, you think, you know what, that was a helpful experience, and now I know that's not for me. The other thing I would say is that, for me, another place that's helped me discern has been in places of service. It's actually where I met my wife in terms of going on a service trip and being a part of service. That opens you up to new experiences, new ways of seeing the world that I think is unexpected and can be pretty powerful too.
Any other questions about turning points or about vocation or? Yes.
How did you find your calling?
How did I find my calling? So when I went to college, I don't even know there wasn't like a moment, but I started to put myself out there a little bit more. I guess it started when I was between my junior and senior in high school. I went into Boys State. Anybody here have been to Boys State or Girls State by any chance? Okay, yeah, a couple of you. So that was a really influential experience for me. It's an experience where you come together and you engage in leadership and politics and so on and so forth. Anyways, the short of it is I did that. I put myself out there to go in that experience. And then when I went to college, you know, it sounds like, well, of course he did this, but at the time this was radical. I ran for freshman class president, all right? I had to put the flyers up and all this sort of thing, which I had never done. I'd never been a class officer or president in high school, that sort of thing. But I don't know, I just felt like, you know what, I'm gonna try this. And it worked, and I enjoyed it, and I found meaning in it and purpose in it. And then I met people along the way. I met a dean of students who poured into me, helped me see some things in my own life that I never saw as possible. And it put me in an environment, right? And obviously I love the university environment, but it put me in an environment that I just felt alive and it felt like it was meaningful and purposeful. So I guess that, again, being open to experiences. For me, it was Boys State, running for class officer, and so on. And then letting life kind of nudge you and pull you in different directions.
We have time for another question or two. Another question.
Or comment even too.
Or comment.
Reaction. Or...
Well, let's express our thanks and appreciation to Dr. Kittle
Sure.
for his wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dan. We very much appreciate
my
that.
pleasure.
We've been
Thank
working
you.
on this for a while, and I'm very appreciative of all of you that have come. I do want to make one very brief announcement. On Monday of this next week, it's Constitution Day, and Dr. Brad Tennant is going to be speaking at 11 o'clock in the new business building in the big Pratt boardroom. So please come on Monday at 11 o'clock to hear Dr. Brad Tennant, our esteemed historian here, and who will be speaking about the Dred Scott case and some surprising ramifications of it. So I would love to have you come again Monday this next week at 11 o'clock in our new business building. Come hear Dr. Brad Tennant speak. Thank you for coming, everyone. Bye-bye.